3 true winter horror stories. Like and subscribe because the last story is shocking. 1. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a break from the chaos of life. I'd rented a cabin in the mountains, far from any town or cell signal, surrounded by dense forests and untouched snow. The forecast had promised light flurries, enough to set the mood, but not enough to cause trouble. The drive up was uneventful, the narrow road winding through trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. By the time I reached the cabin, the snow had begun falling steadily, covering the ground in a soft, pristine blanket. It was beautiful, serene even, and I felt the weight of stress lift from my shoulders. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, with a small fireplace and a window that looked out onto the woods. I spent the first evening reading by the fire, listening to the wind gently rattling the windows. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until the next day, and I felt completely at ease, wrapped in a cocoon of warmth and isolation. But by the second night, the storm had arrived in full force. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow came down in heavy sheets, piling up against the cabin walls and blocking out any view of the forest. I had plenty of supplies and firewood, so I wasn't worried. The storm would pass, and I would return to my life, feeling refreshed. It was around midnight when I first heard the knocking. At first, I thought it was just the storm, branches snapping under the weight of the snow, or maybe something hitting the roof. But the sound was rhythmic, deliberate. 3 slow knocks on the door. I froze, my book slipping from my hands. Who could possibly be out here in this weather? The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen another car or person since arriving. Cautiously, I approached the door. Through the small window, I could see nothing but darkness and swirling snow. My hand hovered over the lock, but something in my gut told me not to open it. The knocking came again, louder this time, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew I was there and was growing impatient. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just the wind and the relentless knocking. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. I told myself it had to be the wind, or maybe an animal brushing against the cabin, but the sound was too precise, too purposeful to be random. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with the fire poker clutched in my hands, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. Eventually, the knocking stopped, but the unease lingered, crawling under my skin. The next morning, I ventured outside, hoping to find tracks in the snow that might explain what had happened. But the snow was untouched, a flawless expanse of white stretching out in every direction. By the third night, the storm had reached its peak, and the howling wind seemed almost alive. The knocking returned, but this time it wasn't just the door. It came from the windows too, moving around the cabin as if something was circling me. I kept the curtains tightly closed, refusing to look, but I could feel it watching. Around 2 a.m., the knocking stopped, replaced by a new sound, a faint scratching at the back door. My stomach churned as I realized whatever it was, it wanted in. Summoning every ounce of courage, I peeked out the living room window. At first, I saw nothing but snow and shadows. Then, at the edge of the forest, I saw it. A figure stood there, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long and its body wrapped in tattered, dark clothing. Its face was pale and featureless, like a blank canvas, and its head tilted unnaturally to the side. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I dared to look again, it was closer. No footprints in the snow, no sign of movement, just closer. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out from fear because the next thing I knew it was morning, and the storm had finally eased. The forest was silent, the snow glittering in the sunlight as if nothing had happened. I didn't waste time packing. I threw what I could into the car and drove away, not looking back. But as I reached the bottom of the mountain, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw the figure standing at the edge of the tree line watching me leave. I haven't gone back to that cabin, and I never will. But sometimes in the dead of night I hear faint knocking on my own door. and I wonder if I ever truly left it behind. 2. Every winter, my friends and I went ice fishing on a remote lake in northern Minnesota. It was a tradition, something we all looked forward to. There was something about the stillness of a frozen lake, the crackling fire on the shore, and the camaraderie that made it the perfect winter getaway. But that year was different. The snow had been relentless, piling up in thick, heavy drifts that transformed the landscape into an endless expanse of white. The cold felt sharper, more biting than usual, and the lake, buried under a thick sheet of ice, seemed eerier than before. We arrived just before dusk, hauling our gear out onto the ice. It was hard work trudging through the snow, but we eventually found a spot that seemed perfect, a little ways from the shore where the ice was thick and solid. The air was painfully still, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. There was no wind, no birds, no distant hum of life. Just the crunch of our boots and the muffled sound of our voices. After drilling a hole in the ice, we set up our lines and waited. Hours passed, and we caught nothing, not even a nibble. My friend Jack joked that the fish had frozen solid, and we all laughed, though it felt forced. There was something off about the lake, a tension we couldn't quite name. It started with a faint cracking sound. At first, we thought it was just the ice shifting, a normal sound on a frozen lake. But then it came again, louder, and this time it didn't stop. The cracks seemed to move, snaking outward beneath the ice like jagged lightning. Maybe we're too close to a weak spot, someone said. We considered moving, but figured the ice was thick enough to hold us. Still, the unease lingered. As we sat in silence, the sound of the cracks grew stranger. They became rhythmic, almost like footsteps, slow and deliberate. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. Then I saw the shadow. It was faint, barely visible through the ice, but unmistakably there. A dark shape, long and sinuous, moving beneath the surface. At first I thought it was a fish, a big one. But the more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't a fish. It was too large, too fluid in its movements, and it wasn't darting like a fish would. It was circling us. I pointed it out to the others, but they didn't take me seriously. Probably a trick of the light, Jack said, but he didn't sound convinced. That's when the ice splintered under him. The shadow had stopped directly beneath him, and in an instant, the ice gave way. He barely had time to scream before he was pulled under. It didn't look natural. It was like something had yanked him down, fast and violent. Panic erupted. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing what we could as the ice continued to crack. The shadow moved again, darting toward us. I could feel the ice vibrating beneath my boots, the cold seeping up into my legs. We ran, slipping and sliding, abandoning our gear as we made for the shore. The shadow followed, its presence marked by the cracks that raced toward us. I'll never forget the sound of the ice groaning, the way it seemed to stretch and buckle under some unseen force. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the others shouting, their voices laced with terror. Somehow we made it to the shore. We collapsed into the snow, gasping for air, our bodies shaking with cold and fear. When I finally turned to look at the lake, it was still again. The cracks had vanished, and the ice was smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. We waited for hours, hoping Jack would resurface, but he didn't. When the search teams came the next day, they found no trace of him. The hole in the ice had frozen over, perfectly smooth, with no sign that it had ever been disturbed. I've never been back to that lake, and I never will. But sometimes, when the winter nights are quiet and the air is still, I think about the shadow under the ice. Whatever it wasn't natural. And I'll always wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to venture too far. 3. I was driving home late one night after spending the holidays with my family. It was supposed to be a simple drive, just a few hours through snowy mountain roads and open highways. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that makes everything feel sharper, and a light snowfall had begun to dust the ground. The first part of the drive was peaceful. The snowflakes drifted lazily, catching the glow of my headlights. I had the radio on low, the faint hum of holiday songs keeping me company. But about an hour in, the snow started coming down harder and the road ahead began to blur. By the time I reached the stretch of highway that wound through the forest, the snowstorm had turned into a blizzard. The visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the road seemed to disappear beneath the heavy white. My GPS lost signal, leaving me guessing at turns and praying I was still on the right path. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague shape in the swirling snow. I assumed it was a tree or maybe a trick of the light, but as I got closer, it became clear. There was someone standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly before coming to a stop. My heart was racing as I strained to see through the windshield. The figure was tall, unnaturally thin, and draped in tattered dark clothing that flapped in the wind. Its head was tilted slightly as though it was looking at me, but its face was hidden in shadow. I honked the horn, the sound muffled by the snow, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, completely still. A wave of unease washed over me, but I told myself it was just some stranded traveler, maybe someone who needed help. I rolled down the window slightly, enough to call out, but the freezing air stole the words from my mouth. The figure took a step toward me. Panic set in. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I slammed my foot on the gas, swerving around it and speeding down the road. My hands were shaking, my breath fogging up the windshield as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a drifter, maybe a prank. But then I saw it again. It was standing by the side of the road ahead, as if it had somehow moved faster than I could drive. This time, I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look directly at it, but I could feel its gaze following me. The further I drove, the worse the storm became. The snow was so thick I could barely see the road, and the wind buffeted the car from every side. The figure appeared again and again, always ahead of me, always standing perfectly still, its presence a dark blot in the endless white. At one point, I glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly lost control of the car. It was there, standing in the middle of the road, behind me, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. I don't know how long I drove like that, heart pounding, hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. The figure seemed to appear and vanish at random, always just close enough to be seen but never long enough to confront. Eventually, I saw an exit sign through the blizzard. It was barely visible, but it was enough to give me hope. I veered off the highway, following the narrow road until I reached a small gas station. The station was empty, the lights flickering in the storm. I pulled up to the pump, breathing heavily, and stumbled out of the car. The cold hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I just needed to feel grounded, to convince myself I was safe. Inside the gas station, the clerk gave me a strange look. "Rough night?" he asked. I nodded, too shaken to respond. I grabbed a coffee and stood by the window, watching the snow swirl outside. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. But then I saw it. The figure was standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible through the snow. It was closer now, close enough for me to see its face, or lack of one. Its skin was pale and smooth, featureless except for two hollow voids where its eyes should have been. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. When I turned to the clerk, he was staring at me, his face pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The look in his eyes told me he already knew. I spent the rest of the night in my car, too afraid to continue driving, too afraid to leave. When morning came, the storm had passed and the world was calm again. But as I drove away from the gas station, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Sometimes late at night, I catch glimpses of movement in my rearview mirror. A shadow, a tilt of the head, a pair of hollow eyes staring back at me. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it's still out there. And I know it's waiting. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe to stay tuned for more videos.